100 to 1. These are just stories, something for the gullible people of ancient times. The idea that there's some sort of super soldier serum, some sort of basic set of principles that can make 100 people more powerful than 10,000 others. It's myth, folklore, right? There's no modern examples of this. People outgunned 100 to 1, winning because of something found in the Mosaic Law. Something that the Hebrews had that the pagan peoples around them lacked. Oh, yes, there is. Let's see if we can puzzle this out. Example number 1. In the first half of the 1800s, the Mexican government began settling the largely empty Texas wilderness with American colonists. They didn't do this out of the goodness of their heart. They did it because the ultra-violent Comanche tribes were pressing down into the area, eradicating other, less belligerent tribes, and even raiding south of the Rio Grande down into Mexico itself. The earliest settlers, the ones who took this cheap land, had no idea what was waiting for them. They never experienced attacks like these. Their answer, the group specially charged with defeating this threat, we'll look at later. Some of those guys absolutely fit our superhero mold. Now, we'll look at the other conflict it spawned. Both sides had a part. The Texian colonists never respected the Mexican government. That government kept changing, and suddenly changing their constitution. When new President Santa Anna changed it again, the Texians had had enough. Santa Anna marched an army to bring them to heel. The first real battle happened at modern-day San Antonio when his army encountered a small group of farmers armed with little more than their hunting rifles. Letters from the survivors tell us that the Mexican generals fully expected this rabble would either flee or just surrender. Instead, what followed was the greatest last stand in all of American history, the Alamo, a name that would become synonymous with a willingness to fight to the very end. The defenders died, here, yes, but it took 2 weeks, and casualty reports for Santa Anna's men ran as high as 2,000. Santa Anna's remaining force after the battle ended was spiritually broken, a shell of its former self, a group that would be mopped up by another small group of farmers just 6 weeks later. Okay, but Mexico had only been a nation for about 30 years when that happened and could hardly be considered a military powerhouse. What if you had to face the most powerful army in the world? What if you had to face the bulk of the Nazi blitzkrieg? In 1941, the Soviets had already had their Alamo when the garrison at Brest Fortress had been trapped with their families inside. Suddenly, the Nazi advantage in men and equipment hadn't seemed to make much of a difference. It was a prelude to what was coming. Early on, the Red Army had surrendered in droves, but as the Germans rolled through the western farmland, they'd gone on a killing spree, murdering untold numbers of women and children. When they arrived at the major population centers of Leningrad and Stalingrad, the Soviets could retreat no further. With their families at their backs, they started to fight, in earnest. Ultimately, they would break the back of Nazi Germany. We don't even have to take the ancient Hebrews' word for this. The modern state of Israel shows us how this works perfectly well. After it formed in 1947, Israel was repeatedly attacked by much larger, much better armed and equipped opponents. Why did all of those multinational armies fail? Because Israel, just like their ancient Hebrew counterparts, were built on a form of a relationship symbolized by a single object, the most powerful piece of survival equipment ever conceived. This guy's a former Army survival trainer. In this video, he talks about water filters, weapons, food, types of shelter. But make no mistake, his biggest advantage, the thing that historically gives him the largest edge over someone who lacks it, is something he doesn't even mention. He's got it. I'm looking straight at it. It's on his left hand. That's right. The greatest piece of survival equipment ever designed. The wedding ring. And make no mistake, it is the wholly owned, completely original invention of the Hebrew Bible. Anyone who says otherwise is lying or simply naive. You won't see this, of course. Watch a movie set in ancient times starring somebody like Maximus here, and we have to give him a wife. Give him his revenge narrative, and if they showed you the reality, you wouldn't be as sympathetic towards him. But no, marriage, as we define it, an exclusive sexual relationship between two people, did not exist outside of ancient Jewish and then Christian societies. Monogamy existed, but it meant you were very poor. The Romans, for example, generally looked down on it. They had matriarchs, someone who bore the official citizen children. But in Roman eyes, if you could only support one sexual partner, you were a failure. A successful Roman like Maximus would have had a whole bevy of slave girls who would have either done whatever he told them or faced any punishment at all under Roman law. In Celtic lands, slave girl was a standard unit of exchange, like a talent of gold. Of course, a harem of wives and concubines was the measure of success in Asia Minor. The reality of every society in the ancient world was a world full of wives, plural, concubines, and sex slaves. All but one. Now, you could legally have more than one wife under Mosaic law, but you had to marry anyone you were intimate with, and that meant paying the bride price and divvying up your inheritance with any one of her children. And in tiny little Israel, where land was at a premium, these things strongly discouraged polygamy. By the time of Jesus, it was culturally taboo. Now, in our modern thinking, this sounds like a bad deal for the man. An ancient living anywhere else could have had all sorts of sexual partners, but was effectively limited to just one if he were Jewish or Christian. But don't feel too bad for them. This state of affairs came with a very interesting side effect. A video like this one breaks it down. Married men suddenly take on responsibility. They work harder. They're more engaged. They pursue advancement. The reason why isn't examined in this video, but it's not hard to understand. The male sex drive, which can be like rocket fuel, propelling men to do all sorts of things, well, it turns out that if society limits his options for sexual satisfaction to one other person, it's just natural that he'll tend to develop very strong feelings for that one person. And like in the video, those guys work harder. They want to show their appreciation to the one person in a way that a ladies' man with a dozen girlfriends doesn't, because he has no strong connection to any one of them. Once Israel starts to get its act together in the early Kings period, it's no accident that Israel suddenly dominates the larger nations around them. They're more cohesive society. Their people are just more motivated. And this model of society has an extreme form, a kind of overdrive switch that cuts on if the people who are so appreciated are suddenly placed in danger. What if their lives are threatened? That's when this thing becomes a superpower. And we get an early example of this in Judges 4 and 5. Remember that the book of Judges occurs during a period known as the Bronze Age collapse. This was the wild, wild west of the ancient world, and that gives us our need for the judges, a word that is synonymous with hero figures from other parts of the world. The difference being that we are told that these people, these demigod-like figures, really lived. So, take Deborah. What's her superpower? It's influence. How does she take on 100 men? She inspires 100 of her own. That may sound like cheating to you. She's not super strong like Samson or a super assassin like Ehud. Doesn't matter. There's no such thing as cheating in the game of survival. You either live or you don't. We don't know exactly what makes Deborah so charismatic. Is it the fact that she was a prophetess, so a religious icon to her people? Was it her looks, a la Helen of Troy, a face that launched 1,000 ships? She rendered the entire encounter with the resurgent Canaanites into a song. It's the earliest example of that type of lyrics that fills the book of Psalms, and it's tempting to wonder whether or not she's one of the originators of the form amongst the Hebrews. But whatever the reason, Israel's military leader at the time, Barak, wouldn't attack without her. He wasn't sure his men would fight for him, but he knew that they'd fight for her. Contrast this possessiveness with the statement that Deborah makes at the end of her song. The widow of the Canaanite general Sisera asks what's taking him and his men so long to return. She gets this faulty assumption. Aren't they just plundering the Hebrews? Aren't they just taking more slave girls? More women they'll just use but never care for, never feel passionate about. This comes with a catch, of course. You have to do it the biblical way, the biblical means of marriage, which means agape love. You're going to go into the relationship with the conviction that you're going to take care of your spouse, no matter what the cost. But do that, and that wedding ring will unlock potential you never knew you had. And when danger comes, you'll find out just what exactly you can survive. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Click like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and keep the videos coming. Also, see the link below to order Book 1 of the Holocaust Engine series, our pandemic post-apocalyptic horror that won the Pinnacle Award for the best science fiction novel of 2020.